"You eat for free here, Mom." He said it like I was a stray he'd taken in, casual, smiling, like 42 years of my life raising him, loving him, building everything he had ever stood on could be reduced to a dinner plate he was generously allowing me to fill. I set down my fork. I did not cry. I did not argue. I pressed my napkin to my lips, excused myself from the table, walked into the hallway, and I called Arthur's attorney. "Charles," I whispered, "it's time." My son had no idea that the woman he just dismissed had already been 3 steps ahead of him for 2 weeks. He never saw it coming. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow my story all the way to the end, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I have been a widow for 14 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. I know that sounds like a strange thing to count. But when you've spent 41 years sleeping beside the same man, when you've memorized the sound of his breathing, the weight of his hand on your shoulder at 2 in the morning, the particular way he took his coffee black, with just a half teaspoon of sugar, even though he always said he took it black, you start counting. Because counting is the only way to prove to yourself that time is still moving even when your whole body is telling you it stopped. Arthur James Wright died on a Tuesday. Heart attack. Sudden. The kind of sudden that doesn't give you time to say goodbye, doesn't give you a chance to tell him that the last argument you had about whether to repaint the front porch didn't matter, that it had never mattered, that nothing mattered except him. I was 67 years old, standing in a hospital corridor, and a doctor I'd never met was telling me that my husband of 41 years was gone. Michael was there. My son. He held my hand in that corridor and he cried, and I genuinely believed that we were going to hold each other up through this, that we were going to be okay, that Arthur had raised a good man. That belief lasted about 6 weeks. Moving in with Michael and his wife Lauren wasn't something I'd planned. It wasn't something I'd wanted. I want to be honest about that, because I think some people imagine that an older woman freshly widowed would be grateful to move into her son's house. And maybe some women are. Maybe some women find comfort in proximity to family. I found proximity to a slow, quiet erosion of everything I thought I knew about my son. The house was large. Michael had done well for himself, a regional manager for a logistics company, Lauren, a dental hygienist who'd built a small practice of her own. They had a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb 40 minutes outside of Cincinnati, with a finished basement and a mudroom that Lauren kept so organized it looked like a magazine spread. Everything in that house had a place, including, I would come to realize, me. My place was the second guest bedroom on the left, the one with the floral wallpaper that Lauren had clearly been meaning to repaint for years. The one where the closet door stuck and the window faced the neighbor's fence. The first week they were attentive. Michael called me for breakfast. Lauren made sure I had extra blankets. My granddaughter Cassie, she was 9 at the time, would climb into bed with me on Saturday mornings and ask me to tell her stories about her grandfather. Those mornings were the only thing that made the rest of it bearable. By week 3, the breakfast stopped happening together. Michael left early for work. Lauren had her own rhythm. I started making my own coffee at 6 a.m., in a kitchen that didn't feel like mine, in a house that didn't feel like mine, in a life that barely felt like mine anymore. That was when I first started noticing the tone. "Joan, I asked you not to use the fabric softener on the dark loads." Lauren didn't yell. She never yelled. That was the thing about Lauren. She had a way of correcting you that was perfectly polite on the surface and somehow felt like a slap underneath. She said my name, not Mom. Joan. She'd called me Mom for 11 years of marriage, and at some point in those first weeks after I moved in, I became Joan. I'd been doing laundry my entire adult life. I raised a child. I kept a home. I managed a household budget that stretched every dollar Arthur earned during the years when dollars were hard to come by. And I was standing in my son's laundry room being corrected about fabric softener. "I'm sorry," I said. "I was just trying to help." "I know," she smiled, "but I have a system." She had a system. I went back to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed with the floral wallpaper, and I thought about Arthur. I thought about the house we'd shared for 38 years, the house where I'd painted every wall myself, where I'd planted the rose bushes along the back fence that were still blooming every June, the house that now sat empty and listed with a realtor because Michael had gently, firmly, lovingly suggested that it was too much house for one woman. "You don't want to be alone out there, Mom. What if something happened?" He'd said it with such genuine concern that I'd believed him. I'd actually believed that was all it was his concern for me. I was starting to wonder. I should tell you about Arthur's trust because it matters. It matters enormously, and I didn't fully understand how much it mattered until it was almost too late. Arthur was not a flashy man. He didn't talk about money. He drove a 10-year-old truck and wore the same winter coat for 15 years and thought that spending more than $12 on a haircut was a form of moral failure. But he was careful, meticulous in ways that didn't show on the surface. He'd spent years working with Charles Whitaker, a trust and estates attorney out of Cincinnati, who had been Arthur's friend since their Army days, to build something that would outlast him, the Wright Family Trust. I knew it existed. I knew Arthur had created it to protect our assets, to make sure that if something happened to him, I would be taken care of. What I did not know what Arthur, in his methodical, trusting way, had perhaps not explained carefully enough were the specifics of how it worked. I knew I was the primary beneficiary. I knew Charles was the trustee. What I had not focused on, what I had simply trusted without scrutinizing, was that Arthur had named Michael as secondary trustee. Contingent on my approval, Charles had explained when he called me 3 weeks after Arthur's funeral. Contingent on your written authorization for any significant transaction. I'd nodded along on the phone, still numb from grief, still moving through days that felt like I was walking underwater. I'd said, "Of course, Michael will help manage things." And I'd meant it with my whole heart. That was my first mistake. "Mom, Michael has been handling your accounts." It was Patrice who told me. My neighbor from the old house, the woman who'd lived 2 doors down for 22 years, who'd brought us casseroles when Arthur had his first knee surgery, who'd stood at Arthur's graveside in November, rain without being asked, because that was simply the kind of woman she was. Patrice had called me in early February, about 3 months into my stay at Michael's house. "What do you mean, handling my accounts?" I asked. "I ran into him at the bank last week," she said. "He was at the counter with a stack of paperwork. I just assumed you knew." I did not know. "He didn't see me," she added. "Or if he did, he didn't say hello. I thought that was odd." I thanked her and hung up, and I stood in the hallway outside my room with the stuck closet door, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the night Arthur died. Not grief this time, something colder, something sharper. I felt afraid. I waited. I want you to understand why I waited, because I've second-guessed myself about this more times than I can count. I waited because I didn't want to believe it. Because this was Michael, my son, the boy I'd driven to baseball practice at 6 in the morning and waited up for past midnight and cried over when he'd gotten his heart broken for the first time at 17. I waited because the alternative, the possibility that my son was doing something dishonest with Arthur's trust, with the money that Arthur had spent his entire working life building, was something my mind kept trying to reject, like a body rejecting a foreign organ. But I watched, I listened, I started paying attention in ways I hadn't been paying attention before. Michael came home late 3 Tuesdays in a row. Not late from work, Lauren mentioned offhandedly that he'd left the office at 5, but he didn't walk through the door until after 8, and each time he said he'd had dinner with colleagues, and each time he looked slightly too composed, slightly too prepared with his explanation. Lauren started making comments about the house, little ones. "We've been thinking about expanding the kitchen. That bathroom remodel we've been putting off. Michael thinks we should finally do the deck." I noticed she never said how they planned to pay for any of it. And then came the Sunday morning when I found the bank statement. It was an accident. Genuinely. I wasn't snooping. I want to say that clearly, because what came next matters, and how it came to me matters. I'd been using the printer in Michael's home office to print a letter I was writing to Arthur's cousin in Arizona. The printer jammed, and when I opened the paper tray to clear it, a folded document slid out from underneath the tray, the kind of thing that gets shoved in a desk drawer and then accidentally migrates. I picked it up to put it back on the desk. I unfolded it, not thinking the way you unfold a piece of paper without registering what it is. And then I read it. It was a transaction summary from the trust account. Not my bank account, the trust. The one Charles managed. The one that required my written authorization for significant withdrawals. There had been 3 transfers in the past 60 days. The first was for $11,000. The second was for $8,500. The third, still listed as pending, was for $42,000. The total was $61,500. I stood there in my son's home office in my slippers holding that paper, and I thought there must be an explanation. There must be something I'm missing. Maybe Charles had authorized these. Maybe there had been a tax payment, an insurance expense, something related to the estate settlement that I'd agreed to and forgotten about. I folded the paper. I put it in the pocket of my cardigan. I went back to my room and I sat down on the bed and I opened my address book, the real one paper, the kind nobody keeps anymore, and I found Charles Whitaker's home number, the one Arthur had written there himself in his careful block handwriting with a note beside it that simply said, "Call if you need him." I called. Joan. Charles picked up on the second ring. It was 10:30 on a Sunday morning. His voice was alert, unhurried, the voice of a man who had been expecting on some level that this call might come. "How are you?" "Charles." I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." A pause. "Always." "Have there been any withdrawals from Arthur's trust in the last 60 days? Another pause. Longer this time. "Joan, what's prompted this? Please just answer me." "There has been one authorized disbursement," he said carefully. "In November, for the estate tax settlement, $11,200. I have your written authorization on file for that one." My hand tightened on the phone. "What about $8,500? Or a pending transfer for $42,000? The silence on his end of the line was the loudest thing I had heard since the silence in Arthur's hospital room. "Joan," Charles said slowly, "those transactions did not come across my desk." And just like that, the last piece of doubt I'd been holding on to dissolved. "What are you saying?" I asked, even though I knew. I knew exactly what he was saying. "I'm saying..." Charles said with the careful, measured weight of a man choosing every word that if those transactions exist, and I have no reason to doubt you, they were not authorized through me. They were not authorized through the trust structure Arthur established, which means someone has been accessing accounts that should require dual authorization. Your authorization and mine. How is that possible? "Secondary trustee status," he said. "If Michael was named on certain of the financial accounts directly, not just the trust but the underlying deposit accounts, it's possible he had independent access. Arthur set up the trust to protect you, but the individual account designations may have given Michael more unilateral access than Arthur intended." I let that land. I let it sit in my chest like a stone. "Can he transfer $42,000 without me signing anything?" "If that account was structured the way I'm concerned, it may have been structured," Charles said. "And if the pending transfer hasn't cleared yet, Joan, we need to act quickly." I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because I think it's important. People expect that when a woman my age discovers that her son has been stealing from her, and let's not dress it up in gentler language, let's call it what it was. People expect you to fall apart, to cry, to collapse into disbelief and grief and the particular agony of betrayal by your own child. I did not fall apart. Something happened that surprised even me. Something Arthur used to call my still water. He said it like a compliment, said there was something in me that went very quiet and very clear when things got hard. He said he'd first noticed it the night our car broke down in a snowstorm in Kentucky in 1987 with Michael in the back seat and not another car in sight, and I'd simply gotten out of the car and started walking toward the nearest light I could see, and Arthur had to run to catch up. That same feeling came to me in the guest bedroom with the floral wallpaper. I was not going to fall apart. I was going to walk toward the nearest light. "Charles," I said, "tell me exactly what I need to do." We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of that conversation, I had a plan. A quiet plan, the kind that doesn't announce itself at the dinner table, the kind that doesn't tip its hand. Charles would contact the bank first thing Monday morning to place a hold on the pending transfer. He would obtain copies of all transaction records. He would review the account designations and flag any irregularities. In the meantime, he told me I should say nothing. Behave normally. Do not let Michael know that anything had changed. "Joan," Charles said before we hung up, "I want you to know something." "What?" "Arthur told me the last time I saw him about 2 months before he died. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I was to look out for you. He said, 'Charles, Joan is tougher than she looks, but she trusts too much. Make sure she's protected.' I should have reached out sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." I couldn't speak for a moment. "He knew you'd be okay," Charles added quietly. "He just wanted to make sure you had backup." I thanked him. I hung up. I straightened my back. I smoothed down the front of my cardigan, the one with the paper still in the pocket, and then I went downstairs and set the table for Sunday dinner, like nothing in the world had changed. That evening, Michael was in a good mood, expansive. The kind of mood that in retrospect I recognize as the mood of a man who believes he is about to get exactly what he wants. He grilled steaks. He opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving. He told a long, warm story about something funny that had happened at work that week, and Lauren laughed, and Cassie sat at the table swinging her legs, and if you'd looked through the window from outside, we would have looked like a perfectly happy family. At some point during the meal, Michael refilled my glass without asking, and smiled at me with his father's eyes. He has Arthur's eyes. He always has. And sometimes it still breaks something loose in me when I look at him, and he said, "You know, Mom, I've been thinking, you've settled in so well here. This feels right, doesn't it? You should just stay. Make this permanent." I took a sip of my wine. I looked at him carefully, the way I used to look at him when he was 17, and trying to convince me he hadn't done something I already knew he'd done. "I'm very comfortable here," I said. And he smiled satisfied and moved on to dessert. Later, clearing the kitchen, he said it. Casually, almost as an afterthought, reaching past me to put a plate in the cabinet. "You know, Mom, you eat for free here." Just those words, tossed out light as air. You eat for free here, like I was a charity case, like I was a burden being graciously accommodated, like the woman who had raised him, who had given him every good thing he had ever had in his life, who had loved him with a ferocity that defied description, like that woman was now in her late 60s, dependent on his generosity for her dinner. I turned to face him. I looked at my son, at those eyes that were Arthur's eyes, in a face that had somehow become a stranger's face, and I smiled. "You're so generous, Michael," I said. And then I excused myself to use the restroom, walked into the hallway instead, and I called Charles Whitaker. "I think it's time," I whispered. "Whatever we need to do, I'm ready." The paper was still in my cardigan pocket. The house was still around me. My son was still in the kitchen loading the dishwasher, completely certain that he was in control. He had no idea that 41 years of marriage to Arthur Wright had taught me exactly one thing that mattered more than anything else. Patience is not the same thing as powerlessness. And still, water, as Arthur always said, runs very, very deep. Charles called me Monday morning at 7:53. I know the exact time because I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I watched the clock on the microwave the entire time I waited for his call, the way you watch a pot you're afraid to look away from. "Joan." His voice was different from Sunday, tighter, controlled in a way that told me he was working hard to keep it that way. "I spoke with the bank." I set down my coffee cup. "And the pending transfer, the $42,000, it's been flagged. They've placed a temporary hold pending verification of dual authorization. We have a window, but it's narrow. The bank manager wants to speak with you directly, today if possible." "I'll be there at 10, I said. "There's something else." A pause. "Joan, I pulled the full transaction history this morning. The $11,000 in November, that one was clean. I authorized it. But the $8,500 in December, that withdrawal has your signature on it, or what appears to be your signature." The kitchen went very still around me. "I didn't sign anything in December," I said. "I know," Charles said quietly. "I know you didn't." I sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said, "I'll see you at 10." And I hung up and I finished my coffee standing at the counter because sitting down suddenly felt like something I couldn't afford to do. Upstairs, I could hear Lauren moving around getting Cassie ready for school. Michael had left at 7:15, same as every morning, briefcase in hand, that easy, confident stride of a man who doesn't expect the ground to shift beneath him. I got dressed. I told Lauren I was going to run some errands and possibly meet an old friend for lunch. She smiled and said, "Have fun." And I noticed she didn't ask which friend didn't ask when I'd be back, didn't ask if I needed anything. Lauren never asked about the details of my life anymore. That used to bother me. That morning it was a gift. I drove myself to Charles's office, 40 minutes alone in that car, and I used every one of those minutes to think. Here is what I knew for certain: Michael had made 2 unauthorized withdrawals from accounts connected to Arthur's trust. He had at some point either forged my signature or obtained it through some document I'd signed without reading carefully enough, and the shame of that second possibility sat in my throat like something I couldn't swallow. I was a grown woman, an intelligent woman, and I had signed things in those first weeks after Arthur's death without reading them the way I should have, because I was drowning in grief, and Michael had been standing there solid and capable saying, "Mom, I just need your signature here for the estate paperwork." And I had trusted him. I had trusted him completely. By the time I pulled into Charles's parking lot, the shame had burned itself out and left something cleaner behind. Not anger, not yet. Something more useful than anger. Clarity. Charles was waiting for me at the door. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him Arthur's funeral, but then I imagined I did too. He shook my hand with both of his, which was how Arthur used to greet people he genuinely cared about, and I had to look away for a moment. "Come in," he said. "I have everything laid out." What he had laid out on that conference table was the story of the past 4 months told entirely in numbers, and it was a more devastating story than I'd prepared myself for. The $8,500 withdrawal in December had indeed carried my signature on a document I now recognized. It was the second page of what Michael had told me was a routine estate administration form, the kind that needed to be filed with the county. I had signed it at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Cassie was asking me something about a school project, and Lauren had put a cup of tea in front of me, and Michael had pointed to the line and said, "Just here, Mom." I remembered the moment exactly. I had not read the second page, I'd been distracted, and I'd trusted my son, and that one moment of distraction had cost me $8,500. "Can we prove it?" I asked. "The original estate form is on file with the county," Charles said. "It has only one signature line. What Michael submitted to the bank was a different document, one he created with your signature transferred from the original. It's document fraud, Joan. It's a crime." I heard the word crime, and something in my chest contracted sharply. My son had committed a crime against me. "What about the $42,000? I asked. That one he apparently felt confident enough not to bother forging. He submitted the transfer request with only his signature as secondary trustee, banking forgive the word on the fact that the bank hadn't been closely monitoring the authorization requirements. They should have caught it. They didn't until I called. Charles looked at me steadily. "Joan, I have to ask you something difficult." "Ask it." "How much do you want to pursue this legally? You have grounds for criminal fraud charges in addition to civil recovery. But Michael is your son. Before we take the next step, I need to know where you stand." I looked at Charles Whitaker, at this man who had been Arthur's friend for 40 years, who had sat with us at dinners and 4th of July celebrations, and who had stood at Arthur's grave in the cold and wept without embarrassment, and I said, "Arthur built that trust to protect me. He worked his entire life for what's in it. I will not let it disappear because I was too sentimental to act." Charles nodded slowly. "All right then. But I'm not ready to involve the police, not yet. I want to look my son in the eye first." "Understood." He slid a folder across the table. "Then let's talk about how you do that from a position of strength." We spent the next hour and 40 minutes going over everything. By the time I left that office, I had a full picture of the financial activity, a set of documents that Charles had prepared, and a very clear understanding of exactly how much leverage I held. The pending $42,000 transfer had been blocked. The accounts had been restructured so that nothing could move without Charles's direct authorization. Michael's secondary trustee access had been suspended pending review. Michael did not know any of this. He came home that evening at 6:30, kissed Lauren on the cheek, ruffled Cassie's hair, and sat down to dinner with the calm ease of a man who had no idea that every card he thought he was holding had quietly been removed from his hand. I watched him across that dinner table, and I thought you looked like your father, and it is breaking my heart that you are not your father. Good day, I asked him. Great day, actually, he said, reaching for the bread. Things are moving at work. Big quarter coming up. He smiled at me. You look nice today, Mom. Did you go out? Just some errands, I said. Ran into an old friend. That's good. You need to get out more. Make sure you're staying social. He said it with that particular brand of condescension that wore the costume of concern, and I smiled at him and agreed, and inside I was perfectly absolutely still. Still water runs very deep. 3 days passed. I went about my routine. I had breakfast. I helped Cassie with her homework in the evenings. I called Patrice twice, careful to keep the conversation ordinary, though she could hear something in my voice. Patrice always could, and she said, Joan, whatever you're doing, be careful. And I said, I'm always careful. And she said, no, you're not. You're brave, which is different and more dangerous. On the 4th day, I found the envelope. It was on the kitchen counter, not hidden at all, sitting next to the fruit bowl like a piece of ordinary mail. Michael's name was in the top left corner. It had already been opened. Lauren must have opened it, and when I glanced at it while pouring my morning coffee, I caught 3 words on the first visible line, renovation loan approval. I set down the coffee pot. I looked at that envelope. I thought about what Lauren had said those weeks of casual comments about the kitchen expansion, the deck, the bathroom remodel. I thought about $42,000. I did not touch the envelope. I did not read it. I went back to my room and I called Charles. They applied for a home renovation loan, I said when he picked up. His voice was unsurprised. For how much? I don't know exactly, but Charles, they were planning to use the transfer to fund renovations. That's what the $42,000 was for. A silence. Then, Joan, that actually helps us. It establishes intent. He wasn't taking the money for an emergency, wasn't covering some unforeseen expense he could claim was in your interest. He was taking money from your trust to renovate his house. His house that he invited me to live in, I said, and I heard my own voice, the flatness of it, the particular flatness of a woman who has just understood something she didn't want to understand. He invited me to move in so he'd have easier access to my finances. Charles didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. I want to be wrong about that, I said. I know, Charles said gently. I know you do. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up, longer than I sat with anything else in this whole terrible stretch of months, because the money, the $60,000, the $42,000 transfer, that was awful, but it was recoverable. Money can be recovered. What Michael had done, if that interpretation was correct, if he'd looked at his newly widowed grieving mother and seen not a parent to be loved and protected, but an asset to be managed and leveraged that was not recoverable in the same way, that was a wound of a different order. I went to find Cassie. She was in the den doing homework, lying on her stomach, with her feet in the air, pencil moving in that loose, effortless way children move when they're not yet aware of the weight of things. I sat down next to her, and she showed me her math worksheet without looking up the way children do when they trust you absolutely and don't need to verify that you're still there. Grandma, she said, still not looking up, are you staying forever? I looked at my granddaughter. This small, bright, uncomplicated person who had climbed into my bed on Saturday mornings and asked for stories about her grandfather and had no idea, not one idea what was happening around her in this house. I don't know yet, sweetheart, I said. I hope you do, she said. Dad seems happier when you're here. She said it simply a child's observation, factual and unweighted. He was really sad when Grandpa died. We all were, but he was like really sad. He would close his office door, and I'd hear him on the phone for a long time, and when he'd come out his eyes would be red. I stroked her hair. He loved his father. I know. She turned a page in her workbook. Grandma, Can I ask you something? Of course. Is our family going to be okay? Children feel everything, every shift, every tension, every held breath at a dinner table. They don't always have language for it, but they feel it in their bones, and Cassie, at 9 years old, had already felt enough to ask that question. Yes, I said with a certainty I was determined to earn. Our family is going to be okay. I meant it when I said it. I still mean it now, but I want to tell you what it costs to mean it, because it is easy to say you love your child through the worst of what they do, and it is a completely different thing to actually do it. To sit across from a person who has betrayed you and still want something good for them. To be angry enough to act and still be a mother. To hold both things at once without letting either one destroy you. That is the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than the grief, harder than the loneliness, harder than any of it. It came to a head on a Thursday evening 10 days after my meeting with Charles. Michael came home with a folder under his arm, brown letter-sized, the kind of folder you get from an office supply store, and after dinner, after Cassie had gone upstairs and Lauren had made herself scarce with suspicious convenience, he set the folder on the kitchen table and pushed it toward me. "Mom," he said, settling into the chair across from me with the relaxed certainty of a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed, "I've been meaning to talk to you about some financial stuff. Nothing complicated, just some paperwork to keep things moving smoothly." I looked at the folder. I did not reach for it. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. "Just some account management forms, streamlining the trust administration a little. Charles has been honestly, Mom, he's getting older and he's a little slow with things. I've been working with a different financial advisor, someone younger, more proactive, and he suggested a few restructuring moves that could really maximize what's in the trust for you." He smiled, his father's eyes. "It's all for you. I just need your signature on a couple of pages." He was looking at me with such practiced, comfortable confidence that for a moment, one single brief moment, I felt the old pull of it. The maternal pull, the lifelong habit of believing in him. Then I heard Arthur's voice in my head, clear as a bell. "Stillwater. Joan." "What pages specifically?" I asked, the faintest flicker. "Just account authorization forms, standard stuff." "Can I read them first?" "Of course." He pushed the folder the rest of the way across the table, leaning back the picture of ease. "Take your time." I opened the folder. The first document was indeed an account authorization form. The second was a limited power of attorney, limited, but broad enough within those limits to give Michael independent authority over 3 specific accounts, including the one that still held the majority of Arthur's estate. I read every word, both pages, all the fine print. Michael watched me read, and his expression stayed pleasant, stayed patient, stayed exactly as rehearsed. When I finished, I closed the folder. I folded my hands on top of it. I looked at my son, and I said very quietly, "Michael, I think we should talk before I sign this." The pleasantness cracked, just slightly, just at the edges like a thin sheet of ice taking the first pressure. He recovered fast. He'd always been quick, my son, but I'd seen it. That half second of something behind the confidence, something that looked a great deal like alarm. "Sure," he said carefully. "What do you want to talk about?" "I want to talk," I said, "about December." The silence that followed those 5 words was the longest silence I have ever sat inside. Michael didn't move. He didn't reach for his water glass, didn't shift in his chair, didn't do any of the small physical things people do when they need a moment to think. He went absolutely, completely still, and in that stillness, I saw something I had not seen on my son's face since he was 16 years old, and I'd confronted him about a lie he thought he'd buried, a flicker of pure, undiluted fear. It was there for maybe 2 seconds. Then the composure came back smooth and practiced like a curtain being drawn. "December," he repeated, as if the word were unfamiliar to him, as if he were genuinely searching his memory. "The withdrawal," I said, $8,500 from the trust account, with my signature on the authorization form. He looked at me carefully. "Mom, I don't know what you're referring to. There were a lot of estate documents that went through in the fall. Charles handled most of it. Charles didn't handle that one, I said. Charles has no record of it, and my signature was taken from a county filing document and placed on a bank authorization form that I never saw and never agreed to. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not yet something more tactical. He was recalibrating. I could see it the same way I used to see him recalibrate at the chessboard when Arthur had him in a position he hadn't anticipated. Michael was always good at chess. He was always good at finding the next move under pressure. "Mom," he said, and his voice dropped into something softer, something that was designed to feel like intimacy. "I think there might be some confusion here. You were in a really difficult place after Dad died. There were a lot of documents. Charles may not have logged everything the way he should have. Like I said, he's getting older." "Stop," I said. He stopped. "Don't tell me what I was," I said. "Don't describe my grief back to me. Don't use the worst months of my life to explain away what you did." He opened his mouth. I held up one hand and he closed it. "I have been to see Charles," I said. "I have the transaction records. I have the original estate filing that my signature was taken from, and I have a very clear picture of what has happened over the last 4 months." The composure broke wider this time. Not all the way Michael was too controlled for that, but I could see the fracture lines spreading. He leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke again, the softness was gone. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was negotiation. "Okay," he said quietly. "What do you want to do?" 4 words. Not a denial, not an explanation, not an apology. Just what do you want to do? As if we were haggling over a price. As if his mother sitting across from him with the evidence of his theft was simply a transactional problem to be managed. And that, more than the money, more than the forged signature, more than any of it, that is what broke my heart cleanly in two. "I want the truth," I said. "That's what I want. I want you to sit here in this kitchen and tell me the truth." He looked at me for a long moment, and then something happened that I hadn't prepared for. His face changed not into the composure and not into the negotiation, but into something rawer than either something I hadn't seen since he was a small boy and had done something he was genuinely ashamed of. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright in the way that means a man is working hard not to cry. "Mom, don't," I said again, because I knew that if he cried right then, if he pulled out the grief of losing his father, I would reach for him instinctively the way I had reached for him his entire life, and I could not afford to do that before I had what I needed. "Not yet. Talk first." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them instead of at me, and he said, "Things got complicated." "Things got complicated," I repeated. "After Dad died, Mom, the business had a bad quarter. 2 bad quarters. I didn't tell Lauren how bad because I didn't want her to worry, and I was covering the gap personally, and the loan I'd taken out was coming due, and I thought I could borrow against the trust temporarily, just to bridge the gap. I was going to put it back. The $8,500, I said. It was a loan to myself. I was going to replace it by March. And the $42,000, a longer silence. That was, I thought, if I could do the renovation, the house value would go up, and we could refinance, and... He stopped, heard himself. "I know how it sounds." "It sounds like you were taking my money," I said. "It sounds like you were taking what your father worked his entire life to build money he set aside specifically to protect me, and using it to finance your own financial mistakes, and forging my signature to do it." "I didn't the signature, He pressed his hands harder on the table. "You signed that document, Mom. You did sign it. I just adjusted which document it was attached to. I thought it was a technicality." "A technicality?" I said. "I know," he said. "I know. I'm not trying to justify it. I just need you to understand I wasn't trying to steal from you. I was trying to keep everything together." I looked at my son. This man sitting across from me with his father's eyes and his own particular failures, and I thought about what Cassie had said. He was really sad. His eyes would be red. We all were. and I thought about the grief that had torn through all of us like a storm and left different wreckage in different places, and I thought about how grief makes people do things that the people they used to be would never have done. None of it changed the facts, but it changed the shape of them. "How much is the loan?" I asked. "The business loan." He looked up sharply, surprised by the question. "36,000, he said. "I've paid down about 8 of it." "So, 28,000 remaining." "Yes. And the business is stable now?" It's recovering. The last quarter was better. I just needed to get through the gap." I stood up from the table. I picked up the folder with the power of attorney documents, and I held it in both hands, and Michael watched me with an expression that I can only describe as a man bracing for a blow he knows he has earned. I dropped the folder in the recycling bin next to the counter. "You will not be getting my signature on those documents," I said. "Not today, not ever. Charles Whitaker will remain the sole trustee of your father's trust with my oversight as Arthur intended. Is that understood? Mom, is that understood?" "Yes," he said, quiet, deflated in a way that should have felt like victory and didn't feel like anything except exhausting. "Yes, I understand." "Good." I moved toward the doorway, then stopped. "Michael, I need you to do something." "What? Oh, I need you to call Charles tomorrow morning. Not me calling on your behalf, not a letter, not an email. Your voice, and I need you to tell him exactly what you told me tonight." He went pale. "Mom, if Charles knows the specifics." "He already knows the specifics," I said. "He's known since Monday. What he doesn't have is your account of it in your words, which is the difference between this being handled privately within the family and this being reported to the authorities." I paused. "Do you understand the difference?" The color drained all the way out of his face. "You went to Charles before you talked to me." "I went to Charles when I found evidence that money was leaving the trust without my authorization." "What would you have had me do?" I kept my voice even. "Would you have preferred I called the police first?" He didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized fully and completely the position he was in, not the position he'd been managing in his head for the last several weeks, but the actual position, the real one, the one where his mother held every relevant card and he held nothing. "Call Charles tomorrow," I said. 9 o'clock, I'll be on the call as well." I went upstairs. I heard Michael in the kitchen for a long time afterward, not moving around, not loading the dishwasher, just sitting. I could picture it exactly. Him sitting at that table in the aftermath of the conversation alone with what he'd done and what it had cost him. I'd sat at many tables like that in my own life. It is a particular kind of alone. Lauren knocked on my bedroom door at 9:30. "Joan." She opened the door a crack. Her voice was careful in a new way, not the bright managed carefulness she usually aimed at me, but something more uncertain. "Michael told me about the conversation. He told me everything." I looked at her. "When did he tell you?" "Just now." She stepped inside, and she looked smaller than usual. Lauren was not a small woman in any sense. She had a confident posture and a direct manner, and I had never once seen her look uncertain, but she looked uncertain now. She looked like a woman who had just had the floor removed from under her and was still trying to locate where it had gone. "Joan, I want you to know I didn't know about the December withdrawal, the forged signature. I didn't know that." I studied her. "What did you know?" She sat down in the chair by the window without being invited, which was the first spontaneous, unmanaged thing she had ever done in my presence, and that told me something. "I knew he'd taken a loan from the trust. He told me it was a standard personal advance, that it was within his rights as secondary trustee. I should have questioned it more. I should have asked you directly. I didn't do that, and I'm sorry." "You knew about the $42,000 transfer." She closed her eyes briefly. "He told me it was to help us catch up on the renovations we'd been putting off, and that the trust funds were available for family use. He said," Lauren's voice faltered, "he said his mother wanted to contribute to the house, to the home she was living in, that it was your idea." I let that land. My son had told his wife that the money was my idea, my gift, my contribution. "It was not my idea," I said. "I know that now." She looked at me directly for the first time, and her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that was clearly genuine and not performance. "Joan, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Go ahead." "Did Michael know when he invited you to move in? Was it because of the trust? Was it a plan?" The question hung in the air. The same question I had asked Charles. The same question I had not been able to fully answer, the one that hurt differently from all the other questions, because the answer changed what my son was in a fundamental way. I thought about the hospital corridor, Michael's hand in mine, his genuine tears. I had known that man for 42 years, had given birth to him, had raised him, and I was certain as I could be, of anything that his grief had been real. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I believe his grief was real. I believe he loved his father. I think he saw an opportunity, and he took it, and I don't know how much of it was calculated from the beginning, and how much of it developed after I was already here. I'm not sure it matters." Lauren pressed her lips together. "It matters to me," she said softly, "because I need to know who I married." That statement surprised me, its rawness, its vulnerability. I had spent months reading Lauren as a woman made entirely of system and surface, and here she was sitting in my room at 9:30 at night pulling the surface away herself. "You need to answer that question," I said. "I can't answer it for you." She nodded. "What happens now?" "Michael calls Charles in the morning. The money is returned to the trust, all of it, with whatever arrangement Charles deems appropriate for repayment. My finances are restructured so that no one has unilateral access to anything. And we decide together what the rest of this looks like." I looked at her. "Lauren, I want you to hear me on this." "I'm listening." "I am not leaving this family. I am not cutting my son out of my life. Cassie is my granddaughter, and I love her, and I intend to be in her life. But things cannot continue as they have been. This house is not a place where I am a guest or a burden or a financial resource. I am this family's mother and grandmother, and if I stay here, and that is still an if, it will be on terms that reflect that." Lauren looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something that I did not expect at all. "I should have called you Mom," she said. "I stopped, and I shouldn't have." I did not say anything. Sometimes the right response to a genuine admission is just to let it exist. "Get some sleep," I said. "Tomorrow is a long day." She left. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room with the floral wallpaper and the stuck closet door, and I held Arthur's watch. I'd been carrying it in my cardigan pocket since the day I left the house, a habit that had formed without my noticing, and I turned it over in my hands the way I did when I needed to think. Arthur had wound that watch every Sunday morning for 30 years. He said it was meditative. I had teased him about it constantly. Who winds a watch? "Arthur, it's not 1955, and he had always laughed and kept right on winding it. After he died, I found it on his nightstand, still running, still keeping perfect time, as if he'd wound it the morning of the day his heart stopped, without knowing it would be the last time. I thought about what Charles had told me. Arthur saying Joan trusts too much. Make sure she's protected. He knew. He loved me, and he knew this about me, and he had built a structure specifically designed to protect me from my own trust. And I had trusted Michael right past it, had handed him the keys, without reading the terms had signed, without looking, because that was what I had always done with the people I loved. I was not going to do it anymore. The call with Charles the next morning was at 9 o'clock precisely. Michael was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs 10 minutes early, coffee in front of him, phone in his hand. He looked like he hadn't slept. He probably hadn't. I had slept better than I had in months, which surprised me, and then didn't, because when you stop waiting for something terrible to happen, and the terrible thing has finally arrived, and you are still standing, the body relaxes in a way it can't when it's bracing. "Mom," he said when I sat down. "I know," I said. Charles answered on the first ring, and for the next 45 minutes, my son spoke. He said things out loud that I don't think he had ever expected to say to another human being. He said I forged her signature. He said I took money that wasn't mine to take. He said, "I am sorry," in the particular broken way a person says it when they mean it without yet knowing if it's enough. Charles listened. He asked questions. He was in the way Arthur had always trusted him to be exactly what the moment required, precise and fair and entirely without cruelty, which is harder than it sounds when you are the attorney of a dead man listening to that man's son confess. At the end of the call, Charles said, "Michael, you understand that Joan has grounds for criminal charges." "Yes," Michael said. He did not look at me when he said it. "And you understand that the decision about whether to pursue that path belongs entirely to your mother?" "Yes." "Joan," Charles's voice shifted to me, "how would you like to proceed?" I looked at my son, this flawed, frightened, grief-stricken man who had made choices that I would spend a long time making sense of, and who was sitting across from me at 8:45 in the morning, looking like everything in his life depended on what I said next. Because it did. "I want the money returned," I said. "All of it with a repayment structure Charles oversees. I want the trust restructured immediately. And I want Michael to commit in writing to a transparent accounting of all financial matters going forward." "And criminal charges?" Charles asked quietly. I looked at my son. He looked back at me, and for the first time since all of this began, he looked like himself, like the boy in the hospital corridor who'd held my hand, like the person who had cried genuinely for his father, like someone who had done a terrible thing and knew it and was not trying to talk his way around it anymore. "No criminal charges," I said, "not if the terms are met." I held Michael's gaze. "But Michael, hear me clearly. If a single dollar moves from that trust without my knowledge and Charles's authorization from this day forward, I will not hesitate. Not for a single second. Do you believe me?" His voice, when it came, was quiet and stripped of everything except what was true. "Yes, Mom," he said. "I believe you." And somewhere in the space between those words and the silence that followed them, something shifted. Not back to what it was, it would never be exactly what it was, but forward into something that at least had the shape of honesty. That was enough to start with. It had to be. The days that followed that phone call were the strangest days of my life, and I have lived through some strange days. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house after a confrontation. Not peace, not exactly, but a held breath quality, like the air after a storm when the rain has stopped, but the sky isn't sure yet whether it's finished. That was what Michael's house felt like in the week after the call with Charles. Everyone was still present, still going through the motions of ordinary life, but every conversation had a new self-consciousness to it, a carefulness, as if we were all aware that the floor had recently proven itself less solid than we'd assumed, and none of us wanted to be the one who found the next weak board. Michael left for work each morning. Lauren went to her practice. Cassie went to school. I made my coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about what came next because the confrontation had been necessary, but it was not the ending. It was, if anything, the beginning of the harder work. Stopping the bleeding is not the same as healing the wound. Charles called me Wednesday of that week. "The bank has confirmed the hold is in place on the $42,000, he said. "Michael's access to the underlying accounts has been formally restricted. I have a repayment structure drafted. I'll send it to you today for your review." "How long for full repayment?" I asked. 18 months, given his current income and obligations. It's aggressive but manageable. He agreed to it without negotiating. That surprised me. He didn't push back. "Not a word," Charles said. "Joan, in 30 years of practicing trust and estate law, I have watched a lot of people respond to being caught. Michael is not responding the way most of them respond. Most of them lawyer up within 48 hours. He hasn't contacted an attorney. He hasn't tried to reframe the narrative. He's just complying." I absorbed that. "What does that mean to you?" "It means he's genuinely ashamed," Charles said. "Which is not nothing. Shame won't give you back the money faster, but it's the difference between someone who is remorseful and someone who is simply outmaneuvered. It matters for what comes next." After I hung up, I sat with that word for a long time. Ashamed. I thought about what shame feels like from the inside. I have felt it myself in my life over things I am not proud of, and I thought about how it either breaks a person open in a way that lets something better in, or it hardens them, calcifies into resentment that eventually turns outward. I didn't know yet which way Michael would go. I wasn't sure he knew either. That evening he came home at 6, same as always, and he walked into the kitchen, and I was at the counter making tea, and he stopped in the doorway and said, "Mom, can I talk to you?" Lauren was upstairs. Cassie was at a friend's house. The kitchen was just us. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I finished making the tea, poured a second cup without asking, set it in front of him, and sat across from him. He wrapped both hands around the cup, the way Arthur used to. I noticed it, the gesture, and I think he noticed me noticing, because something moved across his face. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this," he started. "Then just say it without figuring it out," I said. "That usually works better." He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. "I want to tell you why," he said, "not as an excuse. I know there isn't an excuse, but you asked for the truth, and I gave you the facts, and the facts they're not the whole truth." "All right," I said. He looked at his cup. "When Dad died, I fell apart. I know it didn't look that way. I kept everything moving, the arrangements, the estate paperwork, the realtor for the house, because keeping everything moving was the only way I could function. If I stopped, I would feel it, so I didn't stop." He paused. "I made a decision about 6 weeks after the funeral, when the business numbers came in, and they were bad. I decided that I was the man of the family now, that I had to fix everything, that I couldn't let anything fall apart because Dad was gone, and I was what was left, and it was on me." He stopped. "That's not an excuse." "I know," I said. "Keep going." I looked at the trust and I saw the numbers, and I thought, it's there, it's just sitting there, and Mom doesn't need all of it right now, and I can borrow against it and fix the business problem, and no one gets hurt. I told myself it was borrowing. I told myself I'd have it back before you ever knew it was gone. He finally looked up at me. I told myself a lot of things that I believed right up until you sat across from me at that table and said the word December, and I saw my own reflection in your eyes, and I couldn't believe what I saw. I didn't speak. I waited. "I became someone I don't want to be," he said. "It came out rough, scraped clean of any performance. And the worst part, Mom, the worst part is that I did it to you. Of all the people in the world." His voice cracked on the last 2 words, a clean break he couldn't prevent and didn't try to. I keep thinking about what Dad would say. I can't even finish that thought. I looked at my son across the table, this broken open, frightened, genuinely remorseful man, and I felt the love I had always had for him alongside the betrayal I was still living inside, and I let both things be true simultaneously, which is something I had been practicing for weeks without knowing I was practicing it. Arthur would be devastated, I said, because lying would not help either of us. He would be devastated, and then he would sit down and he would ask you the same question I'm asking you now. What are you going to do about it? Michael looked at me. "I'm going to fix it," he said. "Every dollar, Mom. And the other thing, the respect, the way things have been in this house. I don't think I let myself see it while it was happening, but I see it now. You are not a guest here. You're not a burden. You're my mother, and I have been treating you like a line item." He pressed his hand over his eyes for a moment. "Lauren and I talked last night, for a long time. She's angry with me. Not about the money, about all of it. She said, 'Your mother calls herself a guest in our house, and you never corrected it.' And she was right. I let that happen. I thought about Lauren in my doorway, saying I should have called you Mom. 2 people suddenly and painfully honest in the same 24-hour period. Grief cracks people in unpredictable directions, but so does shame, and sometimes, just sometimes, the crack lets the light in. I need time, I said. I need time to trust you again. I want to get there. But I need you to understand that trust is not given back on a schedule. It comes back when it comes back and not before." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me yet. I'm just asking you to stay. Don't leave this family." "I told you," I said. "I'm not leaving this family. This family is all I have left of your father." "Do you think I would walk away from that?" He shook his head, and then he cried. really cried, not the controlled red-eyed grief I'd seen in glimpses, but the full, ugly, honest kind, the kind that doesn't care how it looks. And I reached across the table and put my hand over his, the way I had done when he was small and hurt and couldn't find the words for it. I did not tell him it was okay, because it wasn't okay yet. But I held his hand, and that was enough for where we were. We sat like that for a while. Then I took my hand back and picked up my tea and said, "You need to apologize to Charles properly, not just comply with the repayment. Call him and apologize to him as a man. He was Arthur's friend. He deserves that." Michael wiped his face with his sleeve, an utterly unguarded gesture. "I will." "Good." I stood. "And Michael?" "Yeah." "The bread comment. You eat for free here." I kept my voice level. "I know you don't think you meant it the way I heard it, but I need you to understand what it cost to hear that." He went still. "I raised you," I said. "I chose your father, and we built a life, and I raised you inside that life, and I gave you every good thing I had, and for 42 years I was your mother, in the full meaning of that word. And I sat at your table in your house and heard my own child tell me I was eating for free as if my presence here is a charity arrangement." I was not crying. I was beyond crying into a place that was clear and solid as bedrock. "Never again. Do you understand me? Mom, I'm... Never again." "Never again," he said. "I swear." I nodded once. I took my tea and I went upstairs, and I heard him in the kitchen for a long time, very quiet, and I hoped that the quiet was the kind that rebuilds rather than the kind that destroys. It was 3 days later that the second thing happened. The thing I had not seen coming, which in retrospect was the most destabilizing thing of all, not because it was worse than what Michael had done, but because it came from a direction I had never thought to watch. I was on the phone with Patrice when my phone beeped with an incoming call. I glanced at the screen. A number I didn't recognize, local area code, and something made me tell Patrice I'd call her back. "Mrs. Wright." A woman's voice, professional measured. "My name is Sandra Ellison. I'm a paralegal at Brewer & Associates. I'm calling at the request of a client who asked me to reach out to you directly before filing." "Before filing what?" I said. "A motion in probate court regarding the Wright family trust." She paused. "Mrs. Wright, are you aware that your late husband had a secondary will amendment filed in October of last year?" The floor moved. "I'm sorry," I said. "A what?" "A codicil to his will, filed with the probate court in October. It amends certain distribution provisions of the Wright family trust." Another pause. "Mrs. Wright, I think you need to speak with your attorney before we go any further. I'm calling as a courtesy, not as an official notice, but I strongly recommend—" "Who is your client?" I said. A careful silence. "I'm not at liberty to say at this point." "Is it my son?" "Mrs. Wright, I really can't—" "Is it my son?" My voice was entirely steady, which surprised me as much as it would surprise anyone, because the rest of me was anything but. "No," she said, after a moment. "It is not your son." I gripped the phone. "Then who?" "I'll be sending an official notice to your attorney of record this week. I'm sorry to deliver this by phone. I thought it was kinder to give you a few days." She sounded genuine. "Not every person who works for the other side is the enemy. Sometimes they're just doing their job and feeling uncomfortable about it. Please call your attorney, Mrs. Wright, today if possible." She hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed and I stared at the wall for 60 seconds, and I did something that I almost never do. I called Charles before I had gathered myself. I called him while I was still shaking. "Charles," I said when he picked up, "did Arthur file a codicil to his will in October?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. I counted. "Joan," he said, and his voice had that same tightness I'd heard the Monday morning after Patrice's call, but different something underneath it that sounded less like urgency and more like dread. "I received a notification this morning from the probate court. I was going to call you this afternoon once I'd reviewed the documents." "What does it say?" "Joan. I need to read it carefully before Charles." I closed my eyes. "Please." He exhaled slowly. "There is a codicil, filed in October, 3 weeks before Arthur's heart attack." It amends the trust to include an additional beneficiary." He stopped. "Who?" I said. Another pause. "The kind that means the person on the other end is deciding whether and how to say what they are about to say." "Arthur had a daughter," Charles said. "A biological daughter. She would be 34 years old. Her name is Rebecca Haynes. She was born in 1991 before Arthur met you to a woman named Carol Haynes. Arthur apparently maintained contact with Carol for many years and provided financial support privately. The codicil—" He stopped again. "The codicil designates Rebecca as a 30% beneficiary of the trust." I heard every word. I understood every word, and for a very long time I could not make any of them connect to the life I had known. Arthur James Wright. My husband of 41 years, the man who had wound his watch every Sunday morning and driven a 10-year-old truck and thought expensive haircuts were a moral failing, had a daughter he had never told me about. A daughter who was 34 years old. A daughter who had been alive somewhere in the world for the entire duration of our marriage, had been alive before our marriage, and he had known and he had filed a legal document 3 weeks before he died to provide for her, and he had still not told me. "Joan," Charles said, "are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. My voice sounded strange to me, distant, like a voice coming from another room. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I had no knowledge of this codicil until this morning. Arthur must have worked with another attorney. It was properly filed, it's legally valid, but I want to be clear that I did not know." "Did you know about her?" I asked. "About Rebecca?" A pause long enough to be its own answer. "Arthur mentioned once, many years ago, that there was a child from before his marriage. He said it was handled. I didn't press. I should have. I'm sorry." "Handled," I said. "Joan." "He said it was handled." I hung up. I sat in the room with the floral wallpaper and Arthur's watch in my pocket, and I felt something I had not felt since the night he died, that same vertigo of ground, disappearing of the person you most trusted, suddenly being someone you did not fully know. First his death, then his son's betrayal, and now this. A ghost walking out of my husband's past, carrying 30% of everything Arthur had ever built. I pressed my hands flat on my knees. I breathed in. I breathed out. I said out loud in the empty room, "Okay, okay, Arthur, okay." And then I called Patrice, not Charles, not Michael, Patrice, because what I needed in that moment was not an attorney and not my son. What I needed was someone who had known me for 22 years and had stood in November rain at my husband's grave and would say the true thing even when the true thing was hard. She answered on the second ring and I said, "Sit down," and she said, "I'm already sitting," and I told her everything in 12 minutes flat, starting with the paralegal's call and ending with Charles's voice saying the word, "daughter." Patrice was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Joan, breathe." "I am breathing." "How long has she been, was she 34 years old?" I said. "Alive before I met him. Alive throughout our entire marriage." "Did he love her?" Patrice asked. And of all the questions she could have asked, that was the one that cut the deepest and also the most necessary, because it was the question I was afraid to ask myself. "I don't know," I said. I think he must have cared about her. He filed that codicil 3 weeks before he died. He knew he was responsible for her in some way. He must have—" I stopped. "He should have told me." "Yes," Patrice said with no softening and no equivocation. "He should have told you." "Why didn't he—" "I don't know, honey. Men carry things. You know that better than anyone. Sometimes they carry things that were never theirs to carry alone, and they convince themselves they're protecting you, and what they're really doing is—" She stopped. "I don't want to speak ill." "Say it." "What they're really doing is protecting themselves," she said quietly. "From the conversation. From the look on your face, from having to see you see them differently." I thought about Arthur winding his watch. Meditative, he always said. Maybe that was true. Or maybe it was a ritual for a man who carried more than I knew, who needed the small, contained certainty of a watch that kept perfect time in a life where other things were more complicated. "What do?" I asked. "About the codicil or about Rebecca?" Both. Either. You talk to Charles and you figure out the legal side, she said firmly. That's step one, and it's not optional. As for Rebecca? A pause. She's not responsible for what Arthur didn't tell you. She was a child. She didn't make the choices he made. I knew that. I had known it from the first moment underneath the shock. The anger I felt was for Arthur, not for a 34-year-old woman who had probably grown up with her own complicated feelings about a father who was never fully present, who had been cared for financially, but perhaps not much else, who had perhaps spent her entire life at the edge of a family she was never invited into. She lost him too, I said. It came out almost involuntarily. Yes, Patrice said. She did. I thought about that. About a woman I had never met, grieving a man I thought I knew completely, sitting on the outside of all the rituals and arrangements that follow. A death not entitled to any of it, perhaps not even permitted to come to the funeral. I thought about her name, Rebecca Haynes. Haynes not right. His name was never given to her. I need to meet her, I said. Patrice was quiet. I know how that sounds, I said. It doesn't sound crazy, Patrice said carefully. It sounds like you. I didn't know yet what meeting her would mean, whether it would break something further or mend something I hadn't known was broken. I didn't know whether she was angry or grieving, or whether she had filed that motion because she needed the money, or because she needed acknowledgement, the simple legal declaration that she had existed in her father's life. I didn't know anything about her except her name and her age, and the fact that 3 weeks before he died, Arthur had made a choice that told me he had never stopped thinking about his obligation to her. That night, Michael and Lauren noticed something had shifted. I was quieter at dinner. Michael kept looking at me, clearly wondering if it was related to their situation, whether I'd changed my mind about the criminal charges or the repayment. He finally said, "Mom, is everything okay?" I looked at him across the table, at Lauren, at Cassie swinging her legs eating her green beans with the particular reluctance of a 9-year-old who has been told she must finish them. "I received some unexpected news today," I said, "about your father." Michael went still. "I'll explain when I know more," I said. It's not a crisis. It's just something I need to understand better before I can talk about it." I looked at him steadily. "But Michael, I need you to promise me something." "Anything," he said, and I believed him. "When I tell you, I need you to let me lead. Whatever I decide, however I decide to handle it, I need you to follow my lead. Not manage it, not fix it, not take over. Follow my lead." He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his face settled not into compliance, but into a genuine recognition that this was what respect looked like, the actual thing, not the performance of it. "Yes, Mom," he said. "I promise." Arthur's watch ticked quietly in my cardigan pocket, still keeping perfect time as if nothing had changed, as if the man who had wound it for 30 years had not turned out to be more complicated than the man I had built my entire life around believing he was. And yet, I could not bring myself to hate him for it. Is that strange? Maybe it is. But 41 years of loving a person does not evaporate because you discover they were more than you knew. It transforms. It becomes something harder and more honest and less comfortable, and maybe that is a better love than the kind that only survives the version of a person you were shown. I was about to find out. Charles arranged everything. That was what Charles did. He arranged the difficult things so that the people inside them could focus on surviving the difficulty rather than managing the logistics. He contacted Rebecca's attorney, Sandra Ellison, on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, I had a date, 2 weeks out. A coffee shop on the neutral ground of a suburb neither of us lived in, chosen by Sandra as what she called a low-pressure environment, which made me think that Rebecca was as nervous about meeting me as I was about meeting her, which somehow made her feel more real than anything else had. I told Michael that night. He took it harder than I expected. Not with anger, with grief, the second wave kind that hits when you think you've processed a loss, and then discover there was a room in it you hadn't opened yet. He sat at the kitchen table after I told him, very still, and then he said, "So she was just out there, my whole life. A sister." "Half-sister," I said, and then immediately felt the smallness of that correction. Yes, out there. Did she know about me? I don't know Michael. I don't know what Arthur told her. He pressed his hand over his mouth briefly. I need to think about this. You have time to think, I said. This meeting is for me first. Whatever comes after that, we decide together. He nodded, but I could see he was somewhere inside himself that I couldn't quite reach, in the place where he was no longer a man who had made mistakes and was trying to correct them, but simply a son processing the discovery that his father had been keeping a door locked in a room of his own house. I understood that feeling. I was living inside a version of it myself. Lauren surprised me again. She waited until Michael had gone to his office, and then she came to find me and she said, "How are you actually doing?" Not "how are you," the way people say it as punctuation. How are you actually doing, with the weight of the word actually carrying everything she meant? I'm still standing, I said. That's not the same as okay. No, I agreed. It isn't. She sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "When I married Michael, your husband shook my hand at the rehearsal dinner and said, 'Lauren, I'm trusting you with the best thing I ever made.' I've thought about that a lot this week." She paused. "I think I let Arthur down. I let things happen in this house that shouldn't have happened, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and that was wrong." I looked at Lauren. This woman I had spent months reading as my obstacle, as the source of the subtle corrections and the cold shoulder carefulness, and I saw someone who was also trying to figure out how to be better than she had been. We were all of us in that house, working on the same thing from different angles. "You can still make it right," I said. "That's where we all are. We can still make it right." She pressed her lips together, nodded once sharply, the way people do when they're holding emotion at arm's length because they need to stay functional. "I'm going to do better," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know," I said. And for the first time since I had moved into that house, I meant it without reservation. The 2 weeks before meeting Rebecca passed in a way that was both very slow and very fast, the way time passes when you are waiting for something you cannot fully prepare for. I called Patrice every other day. I talked to Charles twice more, going over the legal implications of the codicil. Rebecca's 30% claim was valid, legally sound, and I was not going to contest it. Charles had asked very carefully whether I wanted to explore grounds for challenge, and I had said no before he finished the sentence. Whatever else Arthur had done or not done, whatever silence he had kept Rebecca, had not chosen to be born into ambiguity. She had not chosen any of this any more than I had. The trust was Arthur's to divide as he saw fit, and he had seen fit to acknowledge her, and I was going to honor that even if I was still not entirely at peace with the way I'd found out. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I was in bed at 10 and awake by midnight, and I gave up at 1:30, got up, went downstairs, and sat in the kitchen with a cup of decaf and Arthur's watch on the table in front of me. I talked to him. I do this sometimes not as a matter of believing he can hear me, but as a matter of needing to say things out loud to the person they're meant for, even when that person is no longer there to receive them. "You should have told me," I said. "I would have been hurt, and I would have been angry, and I would have needed time, but I would have gotten there. You know I would have gotten there. That's what you didn't trust Arthur, not me, but the process. You didn't trust that I could handle the hard version of you." I turned the watch over in my hands. "I handled every other hard version you ever gave me. 41 years of hard versions. This one would not have been different." The kitchen was quiet around me. No answer, of course. No answer except the small sound of the watch ticking, with the same indifferent precision it had kept since the last Sunday morning Arthur wound it. But here's what I also said, because the truth has to be the whole truth. I still love you. That hasn't changed. You were more than this secret, and more than the mistake of keeping it, and I know that, and I'm not going to let this be the thing that defines you to me. You built something for me. You protected me, even when you were protecting yourself from the conversation you were afraid to have. And tomorrow I'm going to meet your daughter, and I'm going to do right by her, because that is what you were trying to do in October, when you finally found the courage to put her name in the document, even if you couldn't find the courage to say her name out loud. I wound the watch. I had never wound it before. I had watched Arthur do it hundreds of times without ever touching it myself, and my hands did not know the precise resistance of the crown, the number of turns. But I figured it out carefully, slowly, the way you learn something new when you're alone and there's no one watching. When I finished, I set it back on the table. It was still running, still keeping time. I went back to bed, and I slept 4 solid hours and woke up ready. Rebecca Haynes was already there when I arrived. I knew her immediately, not because she looked like Arthur, though she did in the bone structure around the eyes and the set of the jaw, in a way that was unmistakable and stopped my breath for a full second when I walked in. I knew her because she was sitting with her hands folded on the table, exactly the way Arthur used to sit when he was nervous and trying not to show it, that particular formal stillness of a person bracing themselves, and I recognized it the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years. She was 34 years old, dark hair, Arthur's eyes unmistakably. She was wearing a blue cardigan, and she looked up when I walked toward her, and her face did something complicated, that I imagine my face also did something complicated in response to, and then I sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "Mrs. Wright," she said. "Joan," I said, "please." She nodded, swallowed. "Joan." She pressed her hands flat on the table, another Arthur gesture, and I saw that she caught herself doing it and was startled by it, as if she'd been doing it her whole life without knowing where it came from and was only now seeing the origin. "I want to say something before anything else." "Go ahead," I said. "I didn't file the motion to hurt you. I need you to know that. My attorney advised me that if I didn't formally establish my standing in the estate, the claim could expire. It wasn't, I'm not doing this for the money specifically. I'm doing it because—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "Because he acknowledged me. For the first time in 34 years, he put my name in a document and said I existed in his life, and I wasn't going to let that disappear because nobody filed the right paperwork." I let that land fully before I responded. She was not talking about inheritance. She was talking about being seen, about the particular hunger of a person who has spent a lifetime being the secret, the side arrangement, the thing that was handled, finally receiving the thinnest slice of acknowledgement and refusing to let it be taken away. "I understand," I said. She looked at me carefully. "You're not angry." "I'm angry at the situation," I said. "I'm not angry at you. You were a child. You did not make the choices that created this." Her eyes went bright. She blinked it back hard, the way people do when they are determined not to cry in front of someone they've just met. "I didn't know about you," she said. "Not at first. My mother told me about him when I was 12, that my father had a family, a wife, a son. She said he cared about us, but he had made his life somewhere else. She wasn't bitter about it. She was just honest." Rebecca looked at her hands. "I was bitter enough for both of us for a while." "That's fair," I said. "I always wondered about you, about what kind of woman he chose, whether you were—" She stopped herself. "Whether I was someone worth leaving us for," I said. She looked up sharply. Then, unexpectedly, something almost like a smile crossed her face, briefly a flash of dry recognition. "Yes," she said. "That exactly." "I don't know how to answer that," I said honestly. "I only know that he loved me, and I believe he cared for you and your mother in whatever limited way he was able to, and I also know that he should have done better by all of us, by telling the truth a long time ago." "Yes," she said quietly, "he should have." We sat with that together, 2 women at a table, each of us holding our piece of a man who was no longer there to answer for himself. There was grief in it, but there was also something else, a strange and unexpected companionship in the shared nature of it. We had both loved him. We had both been let down by the same silence. We were both in our very different ways, dealing with the aftermath of a man who had been good in many ways and insufficient in this one crucial way, and neither of us was the villain of the other's story. "Did he—" Rebecca started, then stopped. "Did he ever mention me to you?" The question was quietly devastating. I could hear in it the long years of wondering, the 34-year accumulation of a daughter asking herself whether she had existed in her father's mind as anything more than an obligation. "No," I said. "I was not going to lie to her. He never told me about you. I'm sorry." Her face did something careful and controlled that told me she had prepared herself for that answer, and it still hurt. "Okay," she said, simply. "Okay." "But he filed that codicil 3 weeks before he died," I said. "He could have died without ever doing it. He had kept the secret for 34 years. Something changed in him in those last months. I don't know what it was, whether he had a health scare before the heart attack that nobody told me about, whether he had some kind of reckoning with himself. But he chose to put your name in that document when he didn't have to. He chose to give you something real." I held her gaze. "That wasn't nothing, Rebecca. Whatever else it wasn't nothing." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said very softly, "He sent me a birthday card last year, in September, the first one ever. There was no message inside, just his name, Arthur." She paused. "My mother called me when she heard about his death. She said he was a decent man who was afraid of the truth, and that the two things can both be true at once." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," I said. "She is," Rebecca said. "She raised me alone, and she never said a bad word about him, and she never made me feel like I was less than for being his secret. That's a lot of grace." She looked at me. "I think I get some of my stubbornness from him. My mother always said so." I thought about that birthday card. September, a month before the codicil. Something had been shifting in Arthur in those final months, a man trying in his careful, private, insufficient way to begin setting things right. Beginning with a card with nothing inside but his name. Building toward a legal document. Maybe if he'd had more time building toward the conversation, he'd never had the courage to start. He didn't have more time. None of us ever have as much time as we think we do. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to answer me honestly, the way your mother raised you." "All right," she said. "What do you want? Not from the trust from this, from whatever this is." I gestured between us. "What do you actually want?" She was quiet for a long moment. I could see her working through it, sorting what was genuine from what had been layered on top of genuine by years of complicated feeling. "I want to stop being the secret," she said finally. "I want to exist. Not in the middle of your family, not as some disruptive thing just to be acknowledged as real, to be part of the true version of his story." Her voice caught slightly. "He had a son and a wife and a whole life that I was kept outside of. I'm not asking to be inside it now. I just don't want to be outside it and invisible. I want to exist in the record of who he was." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She went very still. "You exist," I said. "Arthur Wright had a daughter named Rebecca Haynes. That is part of the true story of his life, and I will not pretend otherwise." I pressed her hand briefly and sat back. "You are not a secret anymore. Not to me." She pressed her lips together hard, one tear carefully not followed by others. She nodded. We talked for 2 more hours. We talked about Arthur, the pieces of him she knew from her mother's stories, the pieces of him I knew from 41 years of daily life, and it was strange and painful, and also in ways I had not expected healing to hear him described from outside the marriage, to find the overlap between who he had been to her and who he had been to me, and to see in that overlap the outline of a person who was more whole than either of us had known. She told me he had paid for her college education anonymously through Carol, that she had only found out it was him years later. I told her about the truck he drove for 10 years because he thought overspending on cars was a moral failing, and she laughed a real laugh surprised out of her and said, "He sent my mother $20 every Christmas in a plain envelope. No card, just $20. She said it was the most Arthur thing imaginable." That laugh that had his timing in it, his dryness, I heard him in it, and it broke something open in me that needed to be broken open. When we finally stood up to leave, we stood on the sidewalk for a moment, in that particular awkward way of people who have just shared something significant and are not sure what the protocol is for the ending of it. Rebecca looked at me and said, "What happens now?" "Now." I said, "I go home and I talk to my son. He has a sister he doesn't know about yet. And I think when he's ready, and when you're ready, that conversation should happen." I looked at her steadily. This family has had enough secrets. I'm done with secrets. She nodded. Me too. "I'll be in touch through Charles," I said. "But Rebecca?" She turned back. "For what it's worth, from someone who loved your father for 41 years, you have his best quality." She waited. "He never gave up on the people he cared about," I said. "Even when he didn't know how to show it. He never stopped. You didn't stop either. You kept coming even when it cost you." I held her gaze. "That's his." She couldn't speak. She nodded once, pressing her lips together, and then she turned and walked to her car, and I stood and watched her go, and I held Arthur's watch in my hand, and I thought, there you are, Arthur. There, in the way she carries herself. There in the set of her jaw. You didn't disappear. You just scattered further than you knew. Michael was waiting up when I got home. He stood up from the couch the moment I walked in, searching my face, the way children do at any age when they're trying to assess the emotional weather before they speak. "How did it go?" "She's real," I said. "She's good. She has your father's eyes." I sat down across from him. "And Michael, she has his stubbornness and his decency, and somewhere underneath all the complicated history, she just wants to belong to the truth of who he was." I looked at my son. "She's your sister. Not an intrusion, not a threat. Your sister." Michael pressed both hands over his face for a long moment. When he lowered them, his eyes were red. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Mom." "When you're ready," I said. "No pressure, no timeline." "I want to meet her," he said. It came out quickly, like a decision made faster than he'd expected to make it. "I don't want to wait too long. I've already spent too much of the last year waiting when I should have been acting." He looked at me with clear, direct, genuinely humble eyes. "I think I get that from you." I smiled at my son. My complicated, flawed, genuinely trying son, who had his father's eyes, and when he was being who he was actually capable of being, some of the best of me as well. "You get the good parts from your father," I said. "You get the stubborn part from me." He laughed. Cassie, apparently still awake upstairs, shouted down, "Are you guys talking without me?" And Michael called back, "Go to sleep." And she said, "I can't sleep. Can Grandma come up?" And I said, "I'm coming." And that was how the most consequential day of my second life as a widow ended, with me climbing the stairs to sit on the edge of my granddaughter's bed, telling her a story about her grandfather. That was more honest than any story I'd told before, because she was 9 years old and resilient, and she deserved the true version of the people she came from. I told her that her grandfather was a good man, and a complicated man, and that those two things lived in the same person the way they live in most people. I told her he had loved her before she was born, had told me on the night of the day Michael called to say Lauren was pregnant, that he felt like the world had just gotten larger. I told her he wound his watch every Sunday morning for 30 years, and that I had wound it myself the night before, and it was still keeping perfect time. She fell asleep mid-story the way children do between one breath and the next, going suddenly and completely still with absolute trust. I sat with her for a while after. Then I stood up and went to my room, and I sat on the edge of the bed, in the room with the floral wallpaper that would, Lauren had told me that week, be repainted whatever color I chose, that the room was mine, that this was my home, that she meant it. I looked around that room, and I made a decision. I was going to stay. Not because I had nowhere else to go. Not because I was dependent or afraid or too old to choose differently. I was going to stay because this family, broken and mending and honest in ways it had not been before, was worth staying for. Because Cassie needed me. Because Michael was trying to become someone his father would be proud of, and he needed a witness to that. Because Lauren had used the word mom and meant it. because Rebecca existed now in the light, and I intended to know her, and this family was large enough to hold her if we chose to make it so. Because Arthur had built something and trusted me to protect it, and protecting it did not mean keeping it exactly as it was. It meant making it strong enough to survive the truth. I put his watch on the nightstand. I turned off the light. And I thought in the dark, the last thought before sleep, I am 68 years old, and I have just lived through the hardest 14 months of my life, and I am still here. And I know who I am, and I know what I will and will not accept, and I know how to love people through their worst, and still hold the line, and still protect what matters. Arthur always said I was tougher than I looked. He was right. He was not right about everything. But he was right about that, and in the end, knowing that holding that was more than enough to move forward on.